The subgenre of the satiric pamphlet illustrates how satire of the time was enmeshed in a discourse that was topical, political, and journalistic. Short, unbound, and inexpensive pamphlets were easy to produce and distribute, like the tweets, comments, and posts that fill our own blogosphere. Elizabethans such as Thomas Dekker, Thomas Nash, and Robert Greene had written satirical pamphlets, but the form proliferated in the early 18th century, which produced its two most famous examples, Daniel Defoe's The Shortest Way with the Dissenters and Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, written in 1702 and 1729 respectively. These two ironic suggestions for policy reforms, both of which engage charged political issues, represent a new variety of mock argument. These proposals, of course, only purport to be modest. They soft pedal extreme ideas, couching violence in euphemism. Defoe, one of England's foundational novelists and a prolific journalist, wrote The Shortest Way in response to an attack on the religious liberty of those Protestants called Dissenters, who did not belong to the Church of England. In 1702, with Queen Anne succeeding King William III, a bill was proposed in Parliament that would make it harder for dissenters to serve in public office. To stroke opposition to the bill, Defoe published The Shortest Way, in which he impersonates the voice of hardline Anglican preachers called high flyers, such as Henry Scaverell and Charles Leslie. In this voice, he calls for the eradication of dissenters from England. He did not range far from his source material. Leslie himself had published pamphlets called A Short and Easy Way with Deists and A Short and Easy Method with Jews. Defoe published the pamphlets anonymously, but was unmasked, and the ensuing controversy upset both sides. Dissenters alarmed at the violence of the proposal, Anglicans angry at being duped. Defoe was convicted of seditious libel and sentenced to stand in the pillory. The pamphlet exposes interpretative difficulties, the most fundamental of which is discerning exactly what is being proposed. Defoe's speaker calls for harsh measures to extirpate dissenters, but he leaves uncertain whether he is calling for execution, exile, or merely the prosecution of leaders. The pamphlet itself is quite ambiguous. Is killing a snake a metaphor for murdering a dissenter, or merely for any method of rooting out dissent? Time and again the speaker appears to propose violence only to make a tactical retreat. Such vague intimations leave the pamphlet a menacing quality. The threat of brutality lurks behind a facade of reason, but never fully emerges. Extremist rhetoric, Defoe shows us, can assume mild and alluring guises. Swift's even more famous proposal differs in notable ways from Defoe's. The idea Swift puts forward is eating babies as a remedy for Irish poverty and hunger. It diverges far more radically from the norms of his era, and his wry comic tone contrasts sharply with Defoe's strident denunciation. But if the tone is more moderate, the irony is ultimately more obvious, and unlike Defoe, Swift calls direct attention to his actual views, most obviously in the long paragraph near the end of his essay that mentions a litany of more mundane and more truly modest reforms. Along with other clues, this paragraph serves to anchor Swift's discourse, pointing us to a non-ironic meaning. Such rhetorical mooring has led Wayne Booth to uphold A Modest Proposal as a model of stable irony whose meaning is unequivocal. Swift is not the modest proposer, and he expects us to see that. But recognizing that Swift doesn't himself endorse cannibalism ultimately tells us little about the peculiar power of his satire. And reducing his meaning to a non-ironic set of pragmatic reforms is at best a first step towards analysis. Swift's proposer attains an aura of rationality by addressing the question of mass hunger in purely economic terms, throwing statistics at us and offering a solution that is, in the jargon of today's idiotic bureaucrats, data-driven. This focus on the numbers diverts us from noticing the extent to which any recognizable idea of morality is absent from his argument. This cold, Spock-like utilitarianism, which views human beings as resources and starvation as a problem of balancing the books, underwrites the proposer's repeated swears into the discourse of animal husbandry, his casual references to the number of breeders, and to a child just dropped from its dam. And once human beings are reduced to livestock, the proposer can blithely invoke not only the discourse of breeding, but also that of hot cuisine. One development indispensable to the flourishing of satire in the era is what Jürgen Habermas called the rise of the public sphere. After the uneasy resolution of the civil war and religious strife of the 17th century, England experienced a combination of developments, economic, religious, political, educational, that transformed the context in which satire was written and read. The close of the 17th century saw the establishment of a Bill of Rights, the elimination of censorship, the first modern cabinet government, and the founding of the Bank of England. As late as the reign of Charles II, much satire has been published scribbly, but as the new century dawned, satire took to print. A growing reading public made writing profitable, and Britain witnessed a proliferation of printed material, books, newspapers, periodicals, and pamphlets, readily available in the thriving metropolis of London. The rise of Parliament and partisan politics meant, moreover, that statesmen had to appeal continually through this medium of print to a public that exerted new influence over political affairs. In coffee houses and salons, literate citizens exchanged ideas, adding a rich layer of debate to the print conversation. The theatres, between their reopening in 1660 and the Restrictive Licensing Act of 1737, offered a public space for often highly political satire by Aphra Behn, among others, Thomas Ottaway, William Wycherley, John Gay, and Henry Fielding. As J. Paul Hunter writes, the world of print had joined the world of conversation, gossip, and rumor in a single devotion to issues of the moment. Just as Defoe's title would be understood in the context of non-fictional pamphlets, so Swift's was read by a public that would have been familiar with serious proposals to remedy poverty, such as an essay or modest proposal of a way to increase the number of people and consequently the strength of this kingdom, written in 1693, a modest proposal for the more certain and yet more easy provision for the poor, written in 1696. But inhibiting the form and exploding it from the inside, Swiftian satire, as Christian Thorne argues, constitutes a generalized attack on the conventions of public discourse and debate, because it destabilizes the very ability of public sphere to test truth claims. Although its reasonableness, it shows how rational argument fails to lead to morally acceptable conclusions. Even if it emerges from a climate in which fierce polemics are the norm, the mock pamphlet, mobilizing a wild subtextual fantasy, exposes the limitations of the public sphere itself. Rather than offering another form of argument, such satire renders argument itself untenable. The battle of the books occasioned by satire did not arise only from political pamphlets. We have some works that are working on contrarianism, the act of going against the mainstream or popular opinion, or the practice of expressing viewpoints that are opposite to what most people believe. Two works, one addressing economic theory and the other domestic relation, illustrate the tendency of 18th century satire to attack cherished pieties and not just polity. Bernard Matville's The Fable of the Bees, written in 1714, makes no policy recommendations, genuine or counterfeit, and treats political questions only on a philosophical level. Yet, it provoked criticism from preachers, poets, and moralists, earning a jab from Pope in the Dunciad and an indictment from a 1723 grand jury for disparaging religion and virtue. It began as a short poem published anonymously in 1705 called The Grumbling of the Hive, and over the next 2 decades, Mandeville supplemented it with prose explication, articulating a political, moral, and economic theory. The fable is a modest proposal in reverse. Mandeville offers an animal fable, an allegory of English society as a prosperous hive of bees. Despite their prosperity, the bees bemoan the dishonesty in their ranks, rousing the indignation of Jove, who rids the bawling hive of fraud. But when fraud is banished, the economy crashes. Greed turns out to have been good, whereas a modest proposal puts forth an unthinkable reform as a remedy for a dire crisis. Mandeville proposes a wholly unobjectionable reform, the eradication of vice, for what turns out to be a specious crisis. With a "be careful what you wish for" irony, he reveals to his readers the unforeseen consequences of their desire. Mandeville thus exposes the unreasonableness and folly of his fellow men, especially of moralists who are always murmuring at and exclaiming against those vices and inconveniences while still enjoying their benefits. But Mandeville has a narrower target too. The philosophy known as benevolism or optimism, promoted by the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, which argued that a natural human propensity for virtue leads to individual and collective happiness. Against Shaftesbury, Mandeville puts forth 2 points. First, what are normally condemned as private vices actually lead to public benefits. Man's vilest and most hateful qualities are the most necessary accomplishments to fit him for the largest, the happiest, and most flourishing societies. Luxury, avarice, and prodigality spur productivity, trade, and wealth. Even criminals like housebreakers and pickpockets create jobs for locksmiths, lawyers, jailers, and judges. Thus virtue is made friends with vice. Beyond this economic argument, Mandeville offers a moral one. Those qualities that we call moral virtues, he claims, are merely perversions of fundamentally immoral passions, the political offspring which flattery begot upon pride. Flattery and self-love are the driving force behind all human endeavors. Mandeville cheerfully redefines our noblest qualities as self-interest in disguise. Military honor means nothing else but the good opinion of others, while sexual modesty is a social custom, not a virtue at all. Was there virtue in modesty, it would be of the same force in the dark as it is in the light, which it is not. Like the Swift of verses on the death of Dr. Swift, Mandeville takes an impish pleasure at contradicting the moral assumptions of his society. The satire of Jane Collier's, an essay on the art of ingeniously tormenting, written in 1753, operates not in the philosophical realm, but in the domestic. But it shares with Mandeville a contrarian comic spirit and a skepticism towards pieties about human goodness. It imitates the 18th century form of the conduct book, a genre written for young women instructing them in proper behavior. But instead of enunciating rules for virtue, Collier offers a how-to guide for petty cruelty, assembling in one small pocket volume the best advice for tormenting one's spouse, children, servants, and friends. In offering this mock advice, Collier elaborates on the immediate example of Swift, whose directions to servants, written in 1745, ostensibly prescribes good manners, but actually catalogues the myriad offenses of butlers, footmen, and maids. Swift's work captures both the haughty frustration of the master, whose directives are ignored, and the passive-aggressive resourcefulness of the servant, who can exercise power only through small acts of defiance. By analyzing women's indirect methods of wielding power, Collier opens their experiences for a satiric treatment far different from the misogynistic mansplaining of Juvenal and Pope. In training its eyes on domestic, erotic, and social relations, Collier's satire also possesses a kinship with the emerging genre of the novel. While not a novel itself, the art repeatedly turns to contemporary novels for illustration, indicating that the new genre was already a favored vehicle for satirical analysis of the domestic. Overall, satire found a natural home in public sphere saturated with polemic. Polemic refers to a speech or a piece of writing expressing a strongly critical attack on or controversial opinion about someone or something. The first daily newspapers appeared in these years, as did the influential journals The Tatler and The Spectator, offering a mix of news and opinion. This climate produced an unprecedented politicization of authorship, as literary works were read in context of partisan debates, and political controversy was virtually the only road to making either a name or a living as a writer. For example, Gay's Beggar's Opera and Fielding's Jonathan Wild which depict a colorful underworld of criminals and prostitutes, were readily understood as coded Tory attacks on the Whig minister Robert Walpole. In short, even literary satire was immersed in and emerged out of the political and cultural debates of the day. Thus, while the long 18th century might seem a stable era in comparison to the previous century with its bloody revolutions, it was yet a turbulent time full of political contest, religious controversy, changing morality, even new understandings of human nature. This was all about the pamphlets that were majorly popular during the Augustan Age. But these were not the only genres that emerged and became popular during the Augustan Age. There are certain other forms that also gained prominence. To know more about these forms, have a look at these series of lectures.